Welcome to January 2025 with the Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Ann Lloyd, and I'm delighted to have you with us. Hope your new year is off to a great start. We have lots of wonderful things ahead, so sit back and enjoy. Hello, I'm Ann Lloyd, and welcome to Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am absolutely delighted to be here with one of my favorite authors, Jessie Childs, who is joining us to talk about life in Elizabethan England through the window of Catholic families. So, Jessie, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I want to jump right in. I love asking people, what drew you to history, to the study of history, and the 16th and 17th century in particular?
I think actually I've just always loved stories and stories about the past. Even when I was very little, I remember my dad, he was very good at bedtime stories, and he would make up stories about conquistadors and sort of Elizabethans and actually sort of White Russians and Bolsheviks and commissars. And his mother, my grandmother, who I never met sadly, but she was a teenager at the time of the Russian Revolution, and she got out with her family. So lots of stories there. So I suppose it was always there with me. And then when I was little, we'd go on family holidays to Scotland a lot, and we'd play in these sort of derelict castles. I remember seeing a priest hole when I was quite young and wondering why grown-ups would want to play hide and seek. I had a cousin who had this wonderful converted priory in Kent, and it was very old. And she ran a B&B there, a bed and breakfast. And quite often, guests would say to her, wow, have you been making strawberry jam this morning? What a strong smell. And she was like, oh no, that's the monks. And it had been dissolved in the dissolution of the monasteries. And, she believed very strongly in the sort of spiritualism of the place. I mean, I'm quite cynical about that stuff, but I just love the idea that we sort of walk side by side with the past. And in certain parts of the UK, you really, really feel it. So I've always sort of been saturated in it, I suppose. And then it was just a subject I studied at school. We all did. And then I did it for GCSEs, and that's when I really got into the Tudors. And I loved the Tudors. I loved that we could see what they looked like, that they were, the Holbeins are just such, realistic pictures. They're not like these medieval people sort of kneeling in prayer with pasty faces and hoods. You can really get a sense of their character. I love their writing. I love the sense of humor. I love this sort of coarseness about them, this sort of childish humor, but also this beautiful Shakespearean language. I love that contrast. I love the sense that they're just like us in many ways, and then in other ways you get completely stopped in your tracks and they're not like us at all. So I love all that. And then I guess I was okay at it. I did it for A-level, and I remember one particular class when we had a supply teacher in. Well, not a supply teacher, he was at the school, but he wasn't our normal teacher. And he just sort of went freestyle in this one lesson, and he had this facsimile of original Elizabethan handwriting, and or maybe it was even Henry VIII's read. It was quite hard to read, and we had to use a crib sheet, and we basically had to decipher it. And that was my first real contact with the actual substance of these letters. Before it was sort of printed letters, or it would all be sort of put in your textbook. So that was really thrilling. And I do remember thinking that was a moment and thinking, I'd love to look at this a bit more.
Oh, that's wonderful. I always love to hear the stories of people who grow up in the UK and experience this in these just natural ways with school and with family trips. I love that. And I love what you say about seeing even a facsimile, but the actual letter, not a transcript printed in your book. Because when I've been lucky enough to go to the British Library or the National Archives, and you're looking at the original document with this very careful but hard to read handwriting, it's right. Just amazing. And it really gives you a different insight into these people. So that's great. And the idea of walking side by side with them in the ways they are like us and not like us And as we look back in time, and I just want to say to people, one of the things, that we'll be really looking at is your wonderful book, God's Traitors. And I took out all of my sticky notes that were throughout this book. It was just so distracting to hold it up with all these different colors. But this was and continues to be such a great resource to me to look at the Catholic side. We so often, and there's so many sources that give us the Protestant side of Elizabeth I's reign. And this really takes us into not a rebellion, but people living their lives. But interestingly, the book starts with a story not during Elizabeth's reign, but I want to make sure I get the date right. In 1828, there was a discovery at Rushton Hall that was just like opening a door. It almost seemed like going through the wardrobe into another world, opening this little area. So tell us about that discovery and that little glimpse into a very different past.
Yeah, that was amazing. It's Rushton Hall. It's this wonderful Elizabethan house in Northamptonshire, and you can stay there. It's a hotel now. I'd recommend it. It's lovely. And it was, yes, the owner at the time wanted to do it up in the French style. So it was a lot of knocking through walls and pulling down old bits. And one day, one of the builders was removing a lintel over the ancient doorway in the Great Hall. And something came down with the rubble. And it was a book. And it was beautifully bound. And it was clearly quite old. So he hacked away at the wall a little bit more. And down came more books and papers. And so in a way it was, yes, it's this sort of time capsule. It's this hidden treasure. And what it was it was buried there, literally immured, secreted away for centuries in this wall by the Tresham family. And it was done so a month after the discovery of the gunpowder plot. Now, Francis Tresham, the son of the owner, was the last man recruited into the gunpowder plot in the sort of last month or so. And he was very reluctant. I mean, we talk about authentic documents. I think he was probably the one who wrote the anonymous letter tipping off the government to the gunpowder plot. But anyway, so a month later, he was arrested and all the papers were bundled up and they were put in this wall. And they're now in the British Library. Again, you can go and see them. And they basically give you a really, really good view, an impression of what it was like to live through the persecution of Catholics, especially in the reign of Elizabeth I. It goes right up to the gunpowder plot. But it gives you a real sense of a family living and interacting and fighting and loving and all of that, but at the same time constantly having to navigate these laws against their faith. So that was a wonderful thing. I mean, obviously not my discovery, but reading about that, it is, yeah, as you say, it's sort of thrilling, and it's one of those. It's why I love history as well so much, Caroline. It's that sort of sense that, we never quite know what happened, and the ground is always shifting, and new discoveries will change our perspectives, and it sort of keeps us honest. It fights against certitude.
Yes, and that's really important because we sort of settle sometimes into a particular narrative and just sort of carry that with us, but it might not be the whole story.
Yeah.
So when we think about that later part of Elizabeth's reign and all of the persecution, we have these two women, Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, who are so dynamic and charismatic and get so much attention. But instead of looking at the two of them, your marvelous book really looks at a family, like you said, an actual family who is living through this. So tell us a little bit, how did you decide upon this family? What was the family like? How did they come and go and fit into sort of the English system? Because there was a pretty specific hierarchy that could help or hinder your not just your success and economic success, but literally life or death during this period of time.
Yeah, you're right, and that's why I wanted to to write about a family, actually, partly because of these incredible women who were right at the center of it. The head of the family was called Lord Vaux, William Lord Vaux, but his daughters, Anne Vaux and Eleanor Brooksby, after she was married, they were known as the Widow and the Virgin. That was their code names. So I kind of like the idea of having this virgin that no one has heard about, Anne Vaux, as a sort of foil to Elizabeth I. I mean, we always think of Mary Queen of Scots as the perfect foil to Elizabeth I, and in so many ways she is. But Anne is this sort of forgotten person. And what I loved about doing the family is I sort of started with William Vaux, and he was really a bumbling kind of aristocrat. He was a sort of, you can imagine him in a sort of historical drama now, or sort of, I think one of my reviewers of the book called him the Earl of Emsworth in a ruff, from Woodhouse. He's not a very threatening person, I don't think. And there's certainly nothing in his letters that suggests to me that he was this radicalized person. What he wanted was to be able to worship his faith freely and carry on with his country life, hunting and shooting and fishing and all that. But in 1580, he got a knock at the door, and the man at the door was dressed as a jewel merchant, but he was in fact Lord Vaux's children's tutor when they had been young. He had gone abroad, he had trained as a priest, and he was also now a Jesuit priest, and his name was Edmund Campion, very, very famous. He sort of started the Jesuit mission in England, and in the end he was caught, and he was tortured, and he was executed. And Lord Vaux was one of, along with Thomas Tresham, actually, of the Tresham Papers we were just talking about. They were two of several gentlemen in the area who had given Edmund Campion a bed for the night, who had hidden him, who had sheltered him, who had heard mass and taken the sacraments from him. And so they were punished for that. Lord Vaux was arrested, he was imprisoned, and basically for the rest of his life he was under suspicion. He was treated as a non-subject, not quite British enough, a fifth columnist, really. So then you get fast forwarding to the Armada, the Spanish Armada threat in 1588. Again, Vaux, also Tresham, also a cousin of theirs called William Catesby, father of Robert Catesby, the ringleader of the Gunpowder Plot. Those three, they're arrested again and they're detained. So you get this sense of sort of just slowly creeping disobedience, and then crackdowns and on people or certainly Lord Vaux, who'd wished to be loyal. And what you see in the next generation, and this is why it's important to do a family, because change through time. And same with Elizabeth's reign and her ministers, they get more radical themselves, and it sort of heaps and it gets incremental both sides. It's tragic, really, because the Vauxes are caught between this rock and a hard place. But you see with the children of Lord Vaux, Henry, his son, who is quite radicalized and is very much involved in the Jesuit mission, but dies in prison. And then the two daughters, Anne and Eleanor, they start sort of looking after the Jesuit priests and becoming very involved in running safe houses and providing cover, and both are implicated in the Gunpowder Plot themselves. So it's this sense of creeping radicalization that I found very interesting. And yes, when we're taught at school, often you're sort of taking notes and your teacher doesn't have that long to explain everything, and to be able to dive really, really deep, like I've been able to do, into these experiences and these grey areas. So I remember noting down about the Babington plot, for example, or the Throckmorton plot, and you kind of think, well, there are good Catholics and there are bad Catholics, but what about the ones in between who are sort of, they might shelter a priest, or they might not tell the state about a forbidden book that they've been given, or they might not go to church when they're supposed to, or they might go to church, but they might cross their fingers and take mass at home afterwards. All these kind of little rebellions, and all these grey areas and these compromises that Catholics have to make to keep their faith. I found that very interesting.
Well, I appreciate that, the idea that it shifts over Elizabeth's reign, because early on, when she comes to the throne, they are able to fairly safely practice their faith, show up at the Anglican or Elizabethan or Protestant. Those words don't mean the same thing now, so I'm never quite sure what to call it. But to show up at Elizabeth's church, but go home and take the mass. But it becomes more difficult on both sides, right? And so there's this, it's like the volumes ramped up on the government response and on the Catholics themselves. And I do find it interesting that through the generations, this particular family becomes more radicalized. Why do you think that happens? Is it what they see happening to their father, or is it what's happening all around them, or a combination?
I think it is. I think they see their father waiting it out. I mean, if you think about it, before Elizabeth, you have Mary, who didn't last very long, and before Mary, you have Edward, who didn't last very long. So I think the hope was that Elizabeth would only reign for 6 years or so, or maybe 16 or 26, or, and on it goes. And so this sort of idea of waiting it out didn't really work. And the Elizabethan establishment, were counting on that. The more people who are born in Elizabeth's reign, the more you have natural Protestants, and the easier it is. I think you're right that at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, there was a measure of maybe not toleration so much, but she was certainly a moderate ruler, relatively speaking. If you look at Spain, France, the Inquisition, there's a sense of international Catholicism on the rise, sort of militant international Catholicism, and really brutal atrocities being committed by Catholics in Europe. It's a sense of holy war, them or us. And Elizabeth, compared to, Philip II of Spain, for example, is definitely a moderate ruler. She doesn't want to force consciences. And I actually, I believe that. And if you look again, at her sister's reign, Mary, so-called Bloody Mary, Elizabeth conformed. And I think that's really interesting. Mary did not conform in her brother Edward's reign. So Mary was far more hardline. Elizabeth would have happily sort of crossed her fingers. Although she was, she was definitely Protestant. She was definitely an educated, devout Protestant. But no one can quite pin down what kind of Protestant she was. She loved the Chapel Royal. She loved the bells and smells. She's been called an odd sort of Protestant, an old sort of Protestant. But it's very, very hard for her. She was excommunicated in 1570 by the Pope. That means that Catholics are not allowed to obey her. They have to think of her as a heretic, an illegitimate ruler. So right from very early on, it's political. And any kind of disobedience in terms of not going to her church is seen and registered in the statute books as a political act of rebellion. So these Catholics who simply want to hear the Mass, for example, or have the last rites when they die, are in fact disobeying. They are being politically disobedient according to the laws of the land, because you're not even allowed to have a priest. And you do, by law, even from the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, have to go to Protestant church services. So they have to listen to the divine service in a way that they didn't believe in, which, for some of them did imperil their souls. Some were happy to cross their fingers, but others who were more hardline, who obeyed the Pope to the letter of the law, that was impossible for them. So they really are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They've got a choice of two betrayals. Do you betray your spiritual master, the Pope, and damn your soul? Or do you betray your queen and, become fined, have your estate confiscated, you might be arrested, you might even be tortured or executed? I mean, it's very, very difficult. And different people navigated it in different ways and at different times.
Right. And I think it's interesting to see how that excommunication really forced people to navigate in a more maybe dangerous or dramatic way than they had before. So we've mentioned Mary Queen of Scots. Her being in England from 1568 onward also made a difference to some of the families and just how they were living. So if this family, all right, and the Treshams and some of these other families were trying to navigate, and they're living in the countryside, how much did what's happening in London with the Privy Council, with Parliament, with Elizabeth affect them? How often were forces sort of sent out? How are they found out when they're away from London in that hot spotlight on the court?
It affects them just because of the legislation in Parliament then is enacted through the counties, through the JPs and the sheriffs and the commissions. So, for example, with the Spanish Armada of 1588, it was decided that anyone who was seen as a security threat would be detained in advance. So they were, the sheriffs were sent, they knocked on the door, they arrested them. Other legislation you have in 1585, very difficult piece of legislation, which basically outlaws priests and says that any priest who had been ordained abroad since the beginning of Elizabeth's reign would automatically be deemed a traitor, and he would be hanged, drawn, and quartered if he was caught. And the ordinary Catholics who sheltered him in their house, they too would be guilty of a capital felony, so they would hang for it. And again, you have county by county, you have the JPs will go out and, if they hear that there might be a priest in a house, they will have a search party. They will bang on the doors, usually at the crack of dawn, when they think they'll catch the priest in the act of saying mass. And they will search the house. And these searches, they weren't just a sort of very polite, looking under the bed. They would really pull the place apart. And once they learned that the Catholics were building these hides, these priest holes, and they were really sophisticated, some of these priest holes, and many still exist and are wonderful to go and see. Once they discovered that they were doing that, they would come with measuring rods and make sure that, one end wasn't longer than the other, or that there weren't any suspicious angles. They would knock, make sure there weren't any hollow spots. They would pay particular attention to chimneys and to attics and to basements. And so that was terrifying, to have your house raided like that. Sometimes just under suspicion, just because a neighbor might have said something. There was one lady, this is an extreme example, but a lady called Margaret Clitheroe. She was the daughter of a butcher from York. And in 1586, she was accused of harboring priests. They found a priest hole in her house, but no priest. And she refused to plead to the charge when it came to the trial. So they enacted this really medieval penalty. It's called peine forte deux. And what it entailed was they stripped her down to a linen shift. They made her lie down. They put a door on top of her, and then they put weights on top of the door until she was crushed to death. The translation of peine forte deux is effectively pressed to death. She was pressed to death not for having a priest in her house, but for refusing to plead to the charge. So it certainly filters down into the counties from London. The other thing is, from 1593, if you are a recusant, the word comes from the Latin to refuse. If you refuse to go to Protestant church services every week, you will be fined £20 a month, which is a hell of a lot of money in those days. Add a couple of zeros, and that's why mainly it's the rich people who can afford to be recusants. But from 1593, these recusants who are listed in recusant rolls, they aren't allowed to travel beyond 5 miles of their home without a license. So they're sort of subjected to control orders, we call them. We used to call them here in the UK. So they can't travel very far. They can't pay their debts. They can't argue cases in equity or at the King's Bench or wherever in London if they want to go there. They can't visit certain relatives. So their lives are definitely affected by what's going on in London and in Europe, because, as I say, when there are flashpoints in Europe, or there's been something particularly grisly happening in Europe by the Catholics, or there's a threat of invasion, it wasn't just the Spanish Armada of 1588, there were 3 or 4 more afterwards. That's when the screws are tightened and the watches are increased, and this sort of sense of, it's sort of red alert. It's that sense of jitteriness. And that's when, they really were affected. And then you've got to add to that extra layer of just this psychological burden, just this bigotry and prejudice. Not everywhere. Some communities effectively sort of looked after their Catholics. But there is that sense, it's certainly in the press, that they are anti-national somehow, that they're not good subjects, that they, at the first opportunity, if the Spanish had landed, that they would have risen up from within and helped them. So there's, and actually it's very resonant now. You get anti-Semitism. You get Jews blamed for Israel. You get Muslims blamed for Hamas. It's this sense that they had nothing to do with it, but unless they outwardly and actively and consistently condemn them all the time, then somehow that they're complicit, and it's tragic.
Yes, and I tend to think of this time when they're so worried about an invasion, but there was certainly an invasion of ideas, because that prevalent fear and suspicion, and you do see these stories of communities turning against each other. So I wanted to follow up, just ask a couple of questions on things you mentioned. The first, let's talk a little bit about priest holes and what they were and how carefully they were built into houses. It wasn't, well, we've got a spare closet, so we'll hide the priest in there and everybody can see the door. They were actually embedded into the house in a way. So tell us a little about that.
Yeah, they are. They're amazing, and they varied in size. So you would have tiny little sort of holes where you would hide not necessarily people, but a chalice, or the massing equipment or vestments, and they could be sort of just anywhere, just sort of under a step. You'd lift up a step, and there would be a sort of hiding hole in a little mini secret store cupboard. In the very early rudimentary days, there was one in a privy. You often get them in chimneys and chimney breasts because there's sort of scope there. There was a chap called Nicholas Owen, Little John, and he was brilliant. It's a brilliant engineer, and he came up with all sorts of ingenious priest holes. There are a lot in Harvington Hall in Worcestershire. I'd recommend any of your listeners to go there next time you're in the UK, because again, you can go and visit. They have a history festival now as well, which is wonderful, and it's barely changed from the Elizabethan period, and you can see there all sorts of ingenious devices. And we also have some really vivid accounts, contemporary accounts from priests about what it was like to be in these halls. And sometimes, it was 7-8 days even. There was a missionary priest called John Gerald, who's very sort of Buccanesque. He's sort of very adventurous, and he would write about all his escapades and escapes. At one point, he was tortured in the Tower of London, and he escaped from the roof of the Tower of London with a rope attached to the roof, and then one with a friend who'd attached it to the wharf over the moat, and he effectively sort of slid down, zip slide, shimmied down, and got away. And that was after torture, after he'd actually been manacled for a very long time. But he has some wonderful descriptions of hiding these priest holes, as does Henry Garnet, another Jesuit, the head of the Jesuits. And they talk about, first of all, not having much food. Often they didn't have much food. They had what was thrust on them at the time. Sometimes if the searchers were relaxed in the evenings, the mistress of the house might be able to sort of feed them some soup or throw them an apple. There was one instance at Hindlip Pool in Worcestershire, where there was a little sort of reed drilled through one of the holes, and so the lady could feed the priest soup and liquids at least. There was another raid that was in 1591, which was. It was sort of a sewer hide. It was this long drain that ran underneath the length of the house, Baddesley, Clinton, and Warwickshire. And there were 9 Jesuits there. They just had a meeting. And for a couple of hours, they had to sort of stand there knee deep in freezing, revolting water, while the mistress of the house, who happened to be Anne Vaux, the Virgin, was upstairs watching this raid go ahead and praying to God that they wouldn't find the priest, which they didn't. And again, the ladies were very good here. I mean, they deployed classic delaying tactics before opening the door, and then sort of came down, and Anne sort of lambasted the guard, saying, "How dare you come to my house so early when no one's up yet and the children aren't up yet?" And before they'd allowed the men in, they turned all the beds round so that they would be cold to the touch, and it wouldn't give away the fact that lots of people had been sleeping, just got out of bed. So that was quite a memorable raid. Of course, there were so many others where priests were caught and they were dragged out, and it must have been terrifying. Sometimes there was sort of dogs would be brought in. And they knew that if they'd be caught, they'd be taken to the Tower of London and they'd be tortured, and by law they would be hand drawn and quartered, and most of them were. Another great place to go to is the Tower of London. One of the towers there, you have a prisoner graffiti. They've carved their names and their thoughts into the walls, and some of them were Elizabethan priests, and they mentioned the torture they've been through.
Yes, it is. The tower is such a great storytelling building. There used to be, I'm not sure if it's still there, because I go as often as I get to England, but I don't always go to all the places. But there used to be a setup of Jean Girard's cell that showed the oranges, because he used those to do the secret writing that lit up with the candle and all that to get his message out to his friends, saying, here's when to come get me, basically. So He's just a great story in himself. So I also wanted to just ask about some of the women, because often we think of the priests and these men and head of household, and that's who we hear about a lot. But you mentioned Margaret Clitheroe, who has a really great, inspiring and tragic story. And then the Virgin and the Widow, these code names for these two sisters. So tell us about the involvement of the women, particularly during this period, because I think their stories don't get told as often.
And they're not in the records so much. I mean, a lot of the stuff with Anne and Eleanor, the widow and the virgin, I had to go back to the original manuscripts. So we're very lucky in this period to have, the Victorian historians catalogued everything and indexed it. And you basically have a lot of the state papers summarized in printed form. And that's wonderful. But as a historian, if you only rely on those, you miss so much. And so it is really important to call up the original manuscripts. Actually, now you can look at them online, the state papers online, and see the original manuscripts, and it gives you so much more. So, for example, there was in the calendar, it just said something like various instructions to various counties about the threat of the Spanish Armada, to search houses in certain counties or whatever. And I was looking at one of the counties, I'd called it up, and there it listed the house at the time, one of the safe houses of Anne and Eleanor, and listed who was staying there, the ages of everyone. And it said at the end that the JP, the sheriff, had sort of written, "It is most dangerous to the state where there is a recusant mistress." They knew that these women were basically the heads of these households. But the reason they could get away with it often is because women in this period, sad to say, but they just did not have the same status in the law as men. They were deemed to be inferior. And of course, that can't be much fun. But what it did mean is that they could sort of fly under the radar in a way that men couldn't, especially if you're a wife. If you're a wife, no matter how much money you had, the moment you married, it was surrendered to your husband. He owned it all. So if you're going to get fined, it's he will get fined, not her. So what often happened actually with Catholic households is the head of the house, the husband, would go to church, and he would ostensibly be Protestant, and he would toe the line. And he would leave his wife to look after the priest in the house and look after the children and bring them up in the Catholic faith. So there were sort of useful ways that women could preserve the faith in a way that men, it was just too risky for them. And you get also with Eleanor and Anne and other recusant mistresses, they sort of provide cover to the priests. I mean, if you have priests, it's great that they could be in disguise, but if you have these unknown people traveling through the shires, they're going to arouse suspicion. Not so much if they're traveling with a few ladies, and especially with children as well. So they could be the schoolmaster quite often. They were disguised as, or a member of the household, a servant, a caretaker. So the women provided really good cover in that way. And again, yes, they could sort of channel money and funds in a way that would arouse suspicion if it was men. So they sort of used their weakness as a strength. And yes, we were talking about the joy of original manuscripts, and you mentioned the orange juice letters. I mean, that's another perfect example. You can look at these letters that Anne has written in orange juice, in invisible ink. And then if you put it to a flame, the writing comes up. So that these letters that have been intercepted are now in the National Archives in the Gunpowder Plot book, and you can see that she has actually written them, and it's an indelible, and it's just such a wonderful piece of material culture. And I did actually do an experiment to make sure that it worked, and at the time my children were very young, so it was brilliant. I think it's the first time, and probably the only time in my life that childcare and historical research have come together so brilliantly. But it was, yeah, that was pretty cool. So they learned all sorts of ways of sort of escaping the official eye.
Well, and that's wonderful because women were just viewed differently, and they used that as their strength, as you say. And I think that's a really powerful thing to remember when we look at these households, that often it's the women who were helping make or making things happen. Yeah. And so when you think of, I mean, I just think of having children in the house and having priests in the house and going down and opening the door and your children are running around, and all of that seems very homey, or very much just like a house. You've just gotten us up. We're tired. We're not ready yet. But the chance that family is taking, because there is indeed a priest hiding, and the level of commitment that you would have had to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. It's yes, it almost sort of, it makes me think of sort of Bugsy Malone, or sort of Prohibition area. It's a sort of sanctified speakeasy. They're holding the guards, and then they're suddenly turning around the tables and getting rid of all the vestments and trying to make it seem as innocent as possible. And then they sit down and they start sewing, and it's hilarious. And it's sort of, yes, going back to the Orange Juice letters, it's a good sort of metaphor. It's sort of this, or a good image. It's the sense that they're invisible until the heat is on. And Anne, she actually suffered from chronic ill health. But Henry Garnet, after that raid when they were hiding in the drains, he said at the end of it, though she has all a maiden's modesty and even shyness, yet in God's cause and in the protection of his subjects, Virgo, the Virgin, becomes virago, this sort of warrior. So I think that the other thing the women had to deal with was the sort of confounded expectations of them. That was supposedly a way of praising her, making, basically sort of privileging her with being a man, but then there were other ways that they were dealt with, and a lot of the press, and it must have been very tedious, would describe them as hot holy ladies, and basically sort of silly sluts chasing after these priests. You've got a priest in your cupboard, or the other thing is that they're just sort of stupid ladies quacking after these. So you get all the misogynistic tropes, really, that they're actually men and they're not feminine enough, or they're too feminine and they're sluttish, or what was the other one? But yeah, they're just too stupid and they don't understand. So that would have been tedious as well. And Anne Vaux and Henry Garnet were constantly accused of having an affair, and even though they were sort of they're clearly sort of monastic, they're sort of sisters and brothers in Christ, with a deep Christian love. But I don't believe ever that they had any kind of intimacy in any other way.
No, because you can see they're willing literally to die for their faith. So, it's just quite extraordinary. So this ongoing, under a white hot spotlight kind of Catholic Protestant issue carries on. And so we've sort of alluded to a couple of things. So the Armada, that 1588, but that's not the only time. It wasn't sort of a one and done. That war continues. The problems between Catholics and Protestants, and some people, Jean Girard and Catesby, end up at the Gunpowder Plot during the reign of James. And so you see that this issue of Catholic and Protestants carries on and continues. And so I want now to sort of shift, because you have a more recent book that I want to talk about a little bit too, because this Catholic Protestant issue carries on. And so, you've written this wonderful book more recently, Siege of Loyalty House, and I see it behind you. So can you sort of, yes, so can you sort of take us, so we've had it really sort of inflamed during Elizabeth's time. It's sort of kept underground because it's in priest holes, but it's very much going on. We have this big moment of the Gunpowder Plot and the crackdowns, because it doesn't actually happen, but it could have happened. And there's all this what could have happened. So take us into the time of Loyalty House, which is called other things by the other side, and how this religious debate has been so important through generations.
Yeah, it's the gunpowder plot. You can sort of link with the Armada and the excommunication of Elizabeth. They are sort of foundational stories of the Protestant national state and in England. And there's that sense, and you get that still with English particularism. You know, you saw it in the Brexit debates, this sense of British exceptionalism, which you must sort of prickle at in America sometimes. But there is, you know, certainly the Puritans at the time thought that England was a chosen nation, God's chosen nation. And that is where there would be the second coming when it happened. And you get that sense. So it's interesting because obviously the gunpowder plot, and it's tomorrow. We're recording this on the 4th of November. It's tomorrow is going to be the bonfires and bells and effigies and all that. But that was obviously celebrating the defeat of a plot to blow up Parliament, the Houses of Parliament. But what you get with the Civil War against Charles I, who was James I's son. So James was Elizabeth's successor. He was the one who would have blown up. So that was, the gunpowder plot was in a way a sort of celebration of the protection of the king and Parliament. But then when you get to Charles I and the Civil War, the Puritans very much say, no, the gunpowder plot is still our plot. It's nothing to do with protecting the Stuarts. It's about Parliament, the protection of Parliament. And it just so happens that the king now, Charles I, married to a Catholic, Henrietta Maria, with a very sort of not Catholic, but Catholic seeming, popish is the word they always used, Archbishop of Canterbury, that in fact it is the king now who is undermining the Parliament, even not with gunpowder, but with these popish influences. So the Civil War is very much, you know, it's about politics, it's about economics, you know, everything is wrapped in. It's very constitutional, it's about freedom. But it is so much about religion too. And the great fear, and the reason that it all sort of kicked off was that Charles and his ministers were sort of fomenting a second popish plot in a way. And he was Protestant. He was always Protestant. But he believed in the beauty of holiness and his Archbishop of Canterbury's vision for this beautified church, which most Puritans who liked it very, very stripped down thought was basically Catholicism. So the Civil War was in some ways an attempt to stop another popish plot. And so I was interested in that. I was interested in what happens to the next generations. There's a heroine in my book who defends the house. It was actually Basing House in Hampshire that became this major royalist stronghold. It held out, and then eventually it was taken and stormed by Oliver Cromwell. And there are some great stories within it. And Inigo Jones was there, the great architect. But there was also this heroine called Honora, and her mother was called Frances Walsingham with an E, and her grandfather, Francis's father, was Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spymaster. And I found that very interesting because Honora was extremely Catholic. So he would have been, you know, shaking in his grave at the thought of her defending this Catholic stronghold. But the Civil War largely was Protestants against Protestants. As I say, the king, Charles I, was Protestant. It was two different views of how to go to heaven, different pathways. But what you do get within that is the old Catholics, like the Marquess of Winchester, who was the owner of Loyalty House. And they almost to a man side with the king because they hate the Puritans. You know, they're still persecuted by the state and by the king. They're still fined. There's still really, you know, repressive measures, but it's still sort of better than being under a Puritan protectorate. So they do side with the king, but it's still sort of mainly Protestants against Protestants. But I think a sort of an understanding of the Civil War helps you understand British history all the way through. But it's, you know, quite a lot of the sources we use for the Tudor period, some of the later ones, look back on the Tudor period with sort of rose-tinted spectacles, especially Elizabeth's reign, all the sort of Gloriana stuff, Good Queen Bess. There's a lot of people say, oh, I wish how it was, you know, it was like that when we fought the Spanish and we knew who we were. So I kind of, and I also, just curiosity, I didn't know that much about the Civil War, I have to admit, until university, really. And even then, I stuck to the Tudors with my earlier books. So it was sort of wanting to understand it better and find out more. And I'm glad I did, because there are some terrific stories and terrific characters. And it's not, I think a lot of people shy away from the Civil War because it seems so daunting. And if you pick up a textbook and it says, well, what were the causes? And, you start going down that route, and it gets confusing and complicated, not worth your time. But actually, that's why I focused. I thought if you focus on one particular event, you can explore the people within it and, create a sense of drama and tension, and almost sort of do the teaching through the stories. I think that's always the best way to do history.
Well, yes. And you mentioned as a student, it was those stories that drew you in. And so you can see that it's going to be the same for readers or listeners, that it's the stories that draw us in. And it's so interesting because by the time, I don't mean by the time, because I'm sure this was true all along, there were Protestants arguing with each other, but you get to the Civil War, and yes, it's Puritans and other Protestants arguing. And it's also someone like Francis with an eye, Walsingham, the spy master, who in two generations, there's a Catholic who is fighting for and with other Catholics. And so those family stories, which you also see with the Vaux family in here, it's just so much about people. And that's one of the things that I love about history, is it really is about the people. And in both of your books, as well as your first one on Henry Howard, but in these two in particular, looking at the people who are involved and how the royal story, which is the big headline story, plays out in sort of more everyday lives.
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to historical novels. In a way, it's similar, isn't it? You take, not that I write novels, everything's grounded in the manuscripts, but I think with historical novels, they will take a big event, but often the characters, unless you're Hilary Mantel and everyone's legitimate historical figures, but often you will create a story with the gunpowder plot or whatever it is as the backdrop, but then focus on these invented characters. And I don't think I'll ever write a historical novel, but I can see why it's fun to do that and to have that freedom.
Well, and it's wonderful to know that these are some of those characters. These are the real characters, but they are the characters that you might not meet anywhere else, because you might not go beyond the calendar where it just mentions there's this households are being investigated and doesn't go into who's in the household, as you can find out. So thank you so much for doing this work and taking us into the household so we can meet the people. Especially, I always really love, especially the women, I have to say, because it's harder to find those stories sometimes. So
it is, yeah.
I just really appreciate that. Now, tell us, are you working on anything now, or where can we follow you and find out more about you?
Oh, well, that's a really good question in terms of following me, because I'm only on Twitter. I'm hopeless, and I'm thinking maybe I shouldn't be on Twitter for much longer, or at least I should go somewhere else. So I think I might very soon join. I'm not even on Instagram yet, Caroline, but I'm going to go onto Instagram maybe, and Threads. So I will watch the space there. But in terms of the next book, my God, I am doing something completely different. And I mentioned my White Russian grandmother, white as in counter-revolutionary, fighting the Reds, the Bolsheviks in the revolutionary Russia. And I never met her. I really barely knew anything about her. Or my grandfather, my English grandfather, who worked for the British government. And I think, well, he certainly did a bit of intelligence work. So I'm delving into their stories. And it was sort of triggered by lockdown, the COVID lockdown. And my mother, who's now in her 80s, sort of said to my sister and me one day, she said, "Oh, don't let me die before I tell you about the deed box." And we're like, "Oh, what deed box?" And anyway, it's sort of the safety deposit box that she had put in the vaults of the NatWest Bank 20 years ago when my dad died. And so we called it up, and it was wonderful. It's this great big black steel box. And inside were all sorts of mementos and jewels and things from other people in our family, but nothing that really sort of chimed too much, until right at the bottom there was this incredibly simple little tin, and inside it, wrapped in tissue paper, there was this little brooch in the shape of a beetle, sort of diamond, and you press the wings at the bottom, and a little bottom button, and the wings fly open and reveal a watch. And my mother says, "Oh, that was Lara's." And Lara was my Russian grandmother, and it's the one thing she managed to sneak out of Russia after the revolution, and she sort of sewed it into the lining of her coat. So I am going to track the flight of this beetle from Russia and Ukraine, in fact, and then into Constantinople, as it then was, Istanbul, where she and my grandfather were very involved in resettling refugees, and then into the Second World War, where they were in Belgrade, and then Paris and Washington and New York, trying to get the Americans into the war, and then finally Tehran. So I've got lots to explore. The handwriting is a hell of a lot easier, but I certainly won't turn my back on the Tudor period. But this is something I just that is calling to me, and I have to do.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait to hear more about that. That does sound wonderful. And we're all glad, all of us Tudor obsessed people are thrilled that you won't turn your back. You'll keep us in mind too.
No one keeps the Tudors in the corner.
No, they refuse. So thank you so much for being with us, for sharing these amazing stories. Especially, we looked at God's Traitors, but your other books as well. And this one coming up, I can't wait to hear more about that. We'll watch for you on Instagram and Threads as Twitter continues to whatever it's doing. But thank you so much for being with us. It's been a real treat.
Oh, thank you very much for having me. It's a complete pleasure. Treat for me too.
Well, thank you. And thank you, everyone, for listening and learning more about how history shows us what's possible. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I appreciate your listening. I would really appreciate it if you'd leave us a rating or share with a friend. It's wonderful to have you part of this journey as we see how history shows us what's possible.